Hi, I'm Miss Tyler, and welcome to Context for Kids, episode 24. But we're not going to do the Torah portion this week. Torah portion solved. I just kept reading it, and I wasn't coming up with anything to teach on it. Not that I can't teach on it, but nothing felt right. And then I remembered, oh my goodness, this week, Purim, which is a Jewish celebration that you might not know about. So today, I'm going to explain to you all about Purim. Now, Purim is something we find in the Bible book of Esther. Excuse me. So, what is the big deal about Esther? Esther is the strangest book in the Bible for two reasons. Can you guess what they are? Have you read it? I hope your family's read it because it's one of my favorite books. It's unique for two reasons. The first is, it's about a woman. Okay, and it's the only book in the Bible that's completely, totally about a woman. And the second reason is, God's never mentioned anywhere, even once in the entire book, but anyone who's reading it can see that he's everywhere. And although we're not going to talk about it this week, it's a book that's loaded with ancient Near Eastern context. But we're not going to talk about that. What I want to do is kind of talk about the celebration. Now, Purim is not like the feast of the Lord that we're going to find in Leviticus 23. Remember, we've already talked about Passover. Passover, what happened? I'm tongue-tied today. Passover was what happened right before the Exodus out of Egypt. And then they were commanded to celebrate a memorial every year. But we're going to talk about that. Next month we'll have another special episode about the Passover. Then there is another feast, and that is Shavuot. And then there's another feast called Sukkot. And on those feasts, all the men were commanded to go to either the tabernacle or the temple and pay tribute to God as a nation and celebrate together and serve God with one shoulder. But this is different. You see, this isn't a feast. This was a celebration commanded by Queen Esther after the most amazing case of national deliverance. And I'm really hoping that your family will join the Jews tomorrow night and read this book, because it's like reading a pirate story. It's got action, it's got adventure, it's got villains, it's got heroes, it's got suspense, and it's got triumph. And in the end, well, I'm not going to tell you what happens in the end, except that a celebration was declared, kind of like a national holiday. Not a holy day, because only God can say what the holy days are, and like I said, we have those in Leviticus 23, but a celebration. Because when God does something amazing, it's always a good thing to celebrate. All right, so Purim is about how God is always there behind the scenes, directing the big picture, even when he seems absent. I told you that in the book of Esther, God's never mentioned. As a matter of fact, things get really, really perilous. And that's kind of like our everyday lives. Sometimes it doesn't seem like God's really paying attention to us. Sometimes things start going wrong, and it seems like everything's just gone crazy. Esther is the one book in the Bible, but not the only situation, where God seems absent, but he's really right there in the middle, directing a much larger picture and working for a much larger deliverance. Sometimes things in our lives that seem like the worst things that could possibly happen actually turn out to be the best things that can possibly happen. Esther's a good example of that. Purim shows us that no matter where we are and how difficult it is to live according to God's ways, that he never abandons his people. Esther was a Jewish girl. She was brought up living a certain way of life. She was brought up keeping the Sabbaths and eating kosher foods. She was brought up, observing the feasts as best she could in Susa, where there was no temple anymore because it had been destroyed. And they were doing their best, but they were in exile. Okay, exile means that the Israelites are not in their homeland anymore. They have been booted out of the land by God because they had been practicing idolatry. But one of the things that we see in the Bible, although the Israelites practiced idolatry before they went to Babylon, they never practiced it again after being in Babylon. The Jews learned the lesson that there is only one God, and he has none other before him. Oh, I forgot. You see, on Purim, one of the things that the Jews do, I just realized I didn't have this on my head, is they dress up. Because Esther is all about the hidden things. And Esther was a hidden Jew in the king's palace. So, like I said, Purim shows us that no matter where we are, and they were in a heathen nation, and how difficult it was to live according to his ways, he never abandons his people. Esther had to hide the fact that she was a Jew from her own husband, the king. And she hadn't become his wife of her own choice. She didn't go looking for him. But that's part of the story, and I want your family to read it for themselves. It's really a good story. So Esther was the queen on the outside, but she had to hide she was a Jew. She couldn't keep the Sabbath. She couldn't eat kosher. Her husband was an idolater. It must have seemed really, really uncomfortable for Esther. But what does God do? You're going to have to find out. Now, Purim shows us that God works through bad situations for the salvation of his people. And the situation we see in the book of Esther is probably the worst one the Jews ever faced. Well, except for the very last years. The last year in Jerusalem, before Nebuchadnezzar finally destroyed it. That was probably the worst. But the events in Esther were very, very bad. And they meant annihilation for all of the Jewish people who were living in the Persian Empire. And at that point, that was all the Jews. The Jews were going to be exterminated. And it seemed like God wasn't there, but God was there. God doesn't have to be obvious to be doing great works. Now, Esther is what I call the middle act in a three-part play of national deliverance for the Jewish people in times when it appeared that they had been abandoned. The first time was Joseph. Terrible things happened to Joseph. We've talked about that. Joseph was put in prison for a crime. First he was sold into slavery by his own brothers. And it must have seemed to him like God wasn't there with him, even though he was blessed in Potiphar's house. But then in Potiphar's house, he was accused of a crime he didn't commit, and he was thrown into jail for many years. And even when he interpreted people's dreams correctly, they forgot about him. One of them actually kind of had an excuse for forgetting about him because he was kind of killed. But the other guy just plain forgot about Joseph. And all those years must have seemed to Joseph like God didn't remember. But God had the big picture in mind. God's not always going to rescue us out of every little thing. Sometimes he's going to let things build because there are things he has to get done for everyone. Not just one or two people, but sometimes a whole nation. Now, so Joseph, it seemed like God wasn't with him until all of a sudden one day, wham! Joseph was second in command of Egypt, but he still wasn't able to live as a Hebrew. He was hidden, just like Esther. He was hidden in the midst of Egyptians. His own brothers didn't even know who he was when they saw him. And Esther, like we've been talking about, Esther was a Jew who was the queen of Persia, and her own husband didn't even know she was a Jew, and she wasn't able to live as a Jew. Who else do we have? We have Yeshua, or Jesus. And Jesus preached an amazing ministry, and he worked many miracles and did many signs and wonders. But then, all of a sudden, they arrested him. And after they arrested him, it sure seemed like God wasn't with him anymore. And God allowed terrible things to happen to him. But why? Well, for the same reason with Joseph and Esther. If Joseph hadn't had all those terrible things happen to him, if it hadn't seemed like God was absent from his life for years and years and years, the Jews, well, they weren't Jews at that point, the Hebrews, they weren't even Israelites at that point. Now, yeah, because Israel was their forefather. Just forget I said it. Okay, so we've got the Israelites. They wouldn't have been saved from starvation if all those terrible things hadn't happened to Joseph. And the Jews, they wouldn't have been able to be saved from the evil Haman if Esther hadn't been queen, hiding in plain sight, like Joseph. And then we have Yeshua, Jesus, our Messiah. When he was on the cross, it did not seem like God was with him. But God and Messiah, they hid. The Father and the Messiah, they hid their plans from the enemy. Because Paul said that if the enemy had known what God's plan was for the redemption of the world, then they never would have allowed the Romans to crucify the Lord of glory. Isn't that cool? And so I love the book of Esther. And I hope you will too. I hope your family will read it this week. And you know what we do? We read it together, and we have different people act out the different parts. People can wear costumes if they want, because like I said, Purim is about what is hidden. And sometimes even God seems hidden at times. But he's not really hiding. We just can't see him in the midst of terrible circumstances. Now, people dress up in costumes. They read the parts. The people act them out. You boo when Haman's name is mentioned, and you cheer when Mordecai's name is mentioned, and you cheer when Esther's name is mentioned. Yeah, and it's fun. And it's all a celebration of how God works in everything for the good of everyone. So, that is why my family loves Purim. And I hope that you'll try it too. Just because something isn't a feast doesn't mean we can't celebrate. There are always amazing reasons to celebrate what God's done in our lives. Today is a perfect example of that. It's my son's 15th birthday. My sons are adopted. My sons were adopted after an amazingly horrible contested adoption. Not from their birth mother, because she's fabulous and amazing, but from a very bad man who was in prison for a very terrible crime. And you know what? When we were going through that, it seemed sometimes like God was invisible. And we couldn't see how on earth he was working in such a terrible circumstance. And literally, nothing went right from the day that Stephanie called us to tell us we were going to be parents until the day, oh my goodness, over a year later, when finally we won in court and the boys were going to be ours. But it was a time of terrible fear, terrible uncertainty, and wondering where God was in the midst of it. But he was working the entire time. So, that is Esther. Purim, like all the things in our life, going through trials, it's all about having faith and caring more for others than we care for ourselves. The moral of the story of Esther was that Esther had to not be afraid. Esther had to care about others more than she cared about herself. And when she decided that it didn't matter if she lived or died as long as she tried to save her people, well, God can always use somebody like that. So, hope you're going to read it, and I hope that you will follow the example of Esther and always go where God tells you to go. Do what He tells you to do. Never lose faith that He's there in the midst. And keep the faith even when times are terrible and it seems like God's abandoned us. So, that's my Purim show. And I really, really pray that you have a wonderful week. You know, I'm praying for you. And I love you. I want you to have a wonderful week studying the Scriptures together. Happy Purim.